Good afternoon. Magandang hapon. Salamat siyang. Today, we will be having our third installment of the UP Institute of Creative Writing and Center for International Studies Asian Literary Forum for 2025. I would like to greet our viewers, online viewers, and also our speakers for today. And I'm sure that everyone is very excited to hear the talks that we have prepared. And I would like to begin first with an introduction to what the Asian Literary Forum is about. It is a way by which we bring Filipino readers in conversation with other Asian literary traditions, both traditional and contemporary. And this time, our theme is extremely important, and everyone is looking forward to listening to the lectures for this afternoon. Our theme is 100 Years of Pramoedya Ananta Toer. Of course, it's about the 100th birth anniversary of the great Indonesian writer Pramoedya Ananta Toer, who was born on February 6, 1925, and passed away on April 30th, 2006. Many of us were introduced to him through the English translations of his Buru Quartet, and we're so lucky to have here some of the foremost exponents of Pramoedya's writing. And later we will be introducing them to our viewers. I think this year that not only in Indonesia, there are a lot of celebrations and fora in Indonesia discussing Pramoedya's life and work. Also, all around the globe, there are various other celebrations. And I think that, and I hope that this will only be the first one in the Philippines, and we will try to have a year-long celebration for Pramoedya's birth centenary. But before we begin, we will have an opening message from the director of the Institute of Creative Writing here in UP, Professor Vladimir Gonzalez.
Magandang araw po sa lahat. Sa ngalan ng likhaan, UP Institute of Creative Writing, pagbati sa inyong nanonood sa Asian Literary Forum 2025. Bahagi pa rin ito ng Literature for Social Development Program ng aming tanggapan, isang programa naglalayong magbigay ng iba't ibang libre at accessible na mga pagkakataong maranasan at mapag-usapan ang iba't ibang mga halimbawa at usapin ng panitikang iniluluwal o umuugnay sa Pilipinas. Ako po si Vlad Gonzalez, Director ng 𝗍𝗶𝘁𝗶. I have been a part of the 𝗍𝗶𝘁𝗶 for almost a decade now, and I have been a witness to this series of projects conducted amidst the most challenging political climates, which in turn affect our university's processes on funding, curricula, and administration. As I record this message, people are debating over former President Rodrigo Duterte's arrest by the International Criminal Court. Mainit na usapan yan lalo sa SOCMED. In the university, we are again faced with a proposal on another round of reduction of units na GE program namin ang tatamaan madalas to meet with certain standards of a world-class education. Part of the 𝗍𝗶𝘁𝗍's mandate is to grapple with these existing administrative and social realities and to provide platforms to discuss these issues through the lens of literature and the humanities. I'm proud to share that the Asian Literary Forum, ALF ang tawag namin, has achieved the Institute's purpose of articulating literature's entanglements with our local communities as well as fellow cultural creators and experts from Asia. We extend our gratitude to Ramon B and Guillermo, hi Sir Bomen, ICW Fellow and Director of the UP Center for International Studies, for spearheading this project since around 2022 or 2023. His expertise and commitment in curating our guests and discussion points for this forum have been always both meaningful and timely. And for this year, we are grateful again for his efforts in bringing in our literary scholars and writers to discuss 100 years of Pramoedya Ananta Toer. Sa gitna ng maraming hamon sa ating lipunan at sa papel ng panitikan at humanidades na lagi at lagi namang hinahamon, palaban lang tayo kaya narito pa rin. Mahalagang magpakilala at muling ipakilala itong mga mahalagang tao at karanasan sa kasaysayan ng panitikan at lipunan dito man sa Pilipinas, patungo sa iba pang mga bansa na kaayon natin sa ating mga layunin. Kaya asahan din ang pag-ako ng likhaan sa paghahanap at paglulunsad ng mga gaytong talakayan habang patuloy na binabasa at kinakata ang iba't ibang salimuot ng ating mundo. Isang mabunga at masayang talakayan ngayong araw. Maraming salamat po sa lahat.
Before introducing our speakers one by one, before they begin their talks, maybe I can give a few words on Pramoedya Ananta Toer in the Philippines and give a little bit of context to this discussion. As I said earlier, the aim of the Asian Literary Forum is to bring Filipino readers and writers in conversation with other Asian literary traditions. And a few weeks ago, I think Max Lane, who's here, asked me to make some kind of bibliography of Pramoedya in the Philippines. So just to get a feel of how Pramoedya has made an impact, or what kind of impact he has had in our scholarly or literary milieu. So I did make that bibliography and I sent it to Max, but it's quite disappointing because it's quite a short bibliography. I hope that after this year we can have a bigger bibliography of studies and translations of Pramoedya's works. So I would like to just go through very quickly on this very quickly through this very short bibliography. So the first one that we can see in this bibliography is a doctoral study dissertation by 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀 from 1989. 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀 was my former teacher. He was my teacher in literary history and also in Bahasa Indonesia. And his study in 1989, which he wrote in France, was a kind of comparison of Pramoedya Ananta Toer and the great Filipino writer Amado Hernandez. So when I was still an undergraduate and I heard about 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀's dissertation, I was extremely intrigued by this, that one could now compare, the works in Tagalog with works in Indonesian here in Southeast Asia. So I was very amazed, and also I was very inspired by the work of 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀. And in that very same year that that dissertation was finished, the first translation of Pramoedya's work would come out in Filipino. This was in 1989 also, and the translation mainly by 𝗩𝗲 B. Quintanar, a former professor of the Department of English and Comparative Literature here in UP Diliman. The title of her translation of This Earth of Mankind is Ang Daigdig ng Tao. So I did look through this, and it seems like it's kind of a mixed hybrid translation from both Bahasa Indonesia, Bumi Manusia, and from English, This Earth of Mankind. So this was published by the Solidaridad Publishing House here in Manila. So that is 1989. I think that was the first time that many Filipinos could now read Pramoedya in the Filipino language. And that became available in our bookstores too, in our bookshelves, in our libraries. Whereas, of course, Max's translations were already circulating among the Filipino readers. And another translation that came later was in 1999. 10 years later, just a short story of Pramoedya entitled Sunat, or Circumcision, translated by 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀. And then later in 2020, which is, you can see the gaps between these translations, they're so vast. And this translation is a translation of 𝗩𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗀𝗀𝗀 di Banten Selatan, once upon a time, or an event in southern Banten, which was translated by myself into Filipino, and it's unpublished, this translation. But this work by Pramoedya does not have any other translation except for Russian, I think, besides Filipino. And it's translated as Minsay Nangyari sa Timog Banten. And quite surprisingly, I saw that there was a play that had been written and performed about Pramoedya in the Philippines, and this was in 2013. And the play was written by 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗹 entitled Pramoedya, and the play was directed by Chris Millado. So these are both favorites of mine. The writer and the director are both favorites of mine, but I have not been able to see this play, and I hope that we can get in touch with them so that maybe this year we can have a performance of this short, I think, one act play about Pramoedya. And after that, we just have some academic articles, not very many academic articles, and some of them written by Arlo Mendoza, the translator of 𝗩𝗂𝗁𝗏𝗏, of course. Arlo is a very good translator from Bahasa Indonesia to Filipino, and also I think a friend of 𝗩𝗂𝗁𝗏. No? So yeah, so we have here just very few, and some MA theses, but that's all. That's all the stuff that we have yet as of this moment in the Philippines about Pramoedya. But I'm sure that many more young people have read his novels. If they have not written about these novels, they have read these novels, and these novels have influenced them. And as Max Lane says, his translations for us and for myself have had life-changing consequences in terms of how we think about the world. So I think that's enough for me for my introduction to this topic, and I think we are all well versed in how important Pramoedya is in world literature and Southeast Asian literature. Now we have a great panel ahead of us in this online roundtable. Kurniawan, Professor Chingbee, and Dr. Max Lane. I think it's an understatement to say that this is a great panel. It's more than just a great panel because I think everyone is very excited to listen and hear what our speakers have to say. So I'll start off without much ado by introducing Kurniawan. So I'm just bringing out his bio. So I myself was introduced to Kurniawan through his novel 𝗩𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 Harimau, or Man Tiger. And I think Ben Anderson and we had a kind of open forum conversation about this in the Philippine National Museum. We discussed this novel, and that was just when it just came out. So I'll just go into Kurniawan's bio. Kurniawan was born in Tasikmalaya, Indonesia, in 1975. He graduated from the Faculty of Philosophy, Gadjah Mada University, Yogyakarta, with an advanced degree on Pramoedya Ananta Toer and Socialist Realism in Literature. That was later published as a book in 1999. He published his first novel, Beauty is a Wound, in 2002, followed by Man Tiger in 2004, and Vengeance is Mine, All Others Pay Cash in 2014. His latest work is Dog Meows, Cat Barks, which will be published in English translation in 2026. In addition to fictional works, he writes literary essays and political opinion in local and foreign media outlets. He received the Prince Claus Award in 2018. He currently lives in Jakarta. So take it away, Eka. Thank you for coming here, joining our online roundtable.
Thank you. So it's good afternoon for everybody, and thank you for the time for I can share my view and a little bit my opinion about Pramoedya. Is for commemoration of Pramoedya Ananta Toer's 10 years. First, I want to share my experience, especially not mine, but my generations who was born in the 70 and maybe 80, how we introduced to Pramoedya as a person and especially his work. In the 90s, I was, to be honest, I never heard about Pramoedya before I was 18. is a little bit same for Indonesian because Pramoedya, in my opinion, is the greatest Indonesian writers. But uh, when I was a student, I never heard about him. I never read his works. So it's kind of obscure names. To be honest, I read a lot of books and I know a lot of Indonesian writer and sometimes some foreign writer, but not Pramoedya until I went to Yogyakarta and attend university. Uh, but it's not because I was in the university and I found the Pramoedya because even in the Gajah Mada University when I went to the library, I didn't found any Pramoedya works at all. Uh, so my first introduction to Pramoedya, to be honest, when I joined the student movement is around 1996 or 1997 uh, from our friends in the student movements when sometimes before sometimes around when we are discussing about politics about the Indonesian culture, some of them I saw some of them read from their works and I just asked what it is, and that's when I introduced to Pramoedya because that time in Indonesia, Pramoedya work is being banned for years. Even after Pramoedya released from Pulau Buru, but and all his work is only available in underground movement. So there is a funny thing that even there is a time when I want to read more his work because what my friend have is only some copy of maybe the Earth of Mankind, but there is no footstep or others in the tetralogy. So I sent a letter to a publisher in Jakarta to ask if they have some copy of the book. Uh, it's very kind that Hasim Rahman, the ones of the publisher, reply my letter that they don't have any copy at all, but they want to give me a the copy version photocopying the book. So until now, I have this photocopying books from Pramoedya. So that's how Pramoedya rediscovery by my generation in 90 because yeah it's almost being deleted or erased by our government, so it's hard to find his book and to know what it is, what his work, and what his why he is so big and at all because at the time even we know that Maxwell and translations is already published in English. In Indonesia, we don't read. Not many people read in English. So it's almost we can reach out this translation too. But after I think how this Pramoedya life and work is always involved with Indonesian politics because after the Suharto step down in 1998, just a few months after that, almost all of his work is begin to publish again by Hasta Mitra at the time, and it's being so popular and maybe bestseller, and almost all the students buy this book, and suddenly we find out our treasure. So we start almost everybody in my circle of students read his work. And I think this is something that inevitable that Once we introduced to Pramoedya, at the same time we introduced to Indonesian literature, but and at the same time to Indonesian politics, because I think that's how we see Pramoedya at that time, and I think until now we always see that Indonesia in Pramoedya there is talking about literature, and at the same time is almost about Indonesian politics. So the next slide, please. Owens already read almost not all of them, but many of them of Pramoedya works at that time because after I introduced with Pramoedya and read a lot of his work, I start to write my finals essay, extended essay for to finish my study at philosophy department in Gajah Mada University. Later, my extended essays, my 𝗩𝗶𝘁𝗶𝗹 is was being published as Pramoedya Ananta Toer and Socialist Realism Literature. The first things that I want to know is his biography. I think it's a little bit sad that even until now there is no official biography of Pramoedya or published. So I think someone has to write it and research about it, because I think Pramoedya, the only memoir Pramoedya wrote is his memoir he wrote in 𝗍𝗶𝗶𝗃, but I think it's not cover all of his life. So I think it's something blank space to fill for the younger generation to write Pramoedya's biography. But I try to read to find out his life and to read the short biography here and then there. For example, from there is a Dutch professor, Mr. 𝗍𝗶𝘁𝗃, who wrote about the Pramoedya too. When I start to know his life and from his short biography, it brought me to know Indonesian history. Like I already said before, that I know more or less about Indonesian history and politics because Indonesian life, Pramoedya life is like we read about the Indonesian modern politics history. Like he first worked as a journalist and started his writing career exactly when in the time of Japanese occupation. He joined the press agency of Japanese occupations. And then she joins the army. Badan Keamanan Rakyat is before being the official army Indonesian. In the revolution era, when the Dutch have military aggressions around the end of 40, and at that time, for the first time, Pramoedya being arrested by the Dutch and imprisoned for the first time. And 11 years later, Pramoedya was imprisoned again by this time by Soekarno government because of the book 𝗍𝗁𝗍𝗁 in Indonesia. Is a book about his I think is one of his writing part of his work that maybe not so much recognized in the outside Indonesia, because Pramoedya wrote a lot of non-fiction work, especially some of historical research. One of them is 𝗍𝗁𝗍𝗁𝗍 in Indonesia, is about how the Chinese influence in Indonesian society and culture, and how the involvement in Indonesia is kind of how he defends this China culture and society in Indonesia, because at that time Soekarno have like bans all the China from the second tier cities in Indonesia. So all of them like have to move to the big city. So that's when Pramoedya wrote those book and uh, contrast with the Sukarno regime and being imprisoned at that time. And again, so when the political power change Indonesia from Soekarno to Suharto, and again Pramoedya have to face the new regimes, and Suharto uh, with the support of the Indonesian army arrest Pramoedya in 1965, letter 66 or 66, and send him to first, I think, to Nusa Kambangan. Is a small island in between West Java and Central Java in the South Ocean. Before Pramoedya sent to Pulau Buru for almost more than 10 years before he was released in 1979 or 1979, because 1 year after that he published his first book of tetralogy Buru. I think when I start to read more about Pramoedya's biography, I start to draw a simple conclusion that Indonesian political historically is very violent, and imprisoning a writer is one of political language. Is like I read a lot of Indonesian history, not because I read historical book or whatever, but because I read Pramoedya's biography. It's something like not indirect learning how to learn Indonesian politics and history. So next slide. So not even in his life, I think is we can see too how politics is very important if when we read all of his work. So that's when I, as a writer, and sometimes I think so all of the Indonesian writer of my generation's view in Pramoedya work is how his book is not only his novel, for example, is not only story tellings, some character who met another character, but it's always very political. From his early works to the latest ones. Uh, for example, most of his work through themes and character, Pramoedya more or less some talk about Indonesia in the context of the works was written, and I learned a lot from the years in the end of the 90s because I read at that time actually I read a lot of Pramoedya. Like I already said that after the Suharto stepped down, a lot of his works is being available again. Not only the most famous one like Tetraburu or Gadis Pantai, or even the minor one is already published. So it's like the time that we can read almost all of his works, even ones that maybe never read a lot by other people, like that Mr. Ramon already translated. Sekali Peristiwa di Banten Selatan is maybe not very popular even here in Indonesia, but at that time this book was being published, so we can have a kind of good access to his works and to to study it for not only to know more about the Pramoedya, but I think as a writer, I start to learn how to find out what we have to write and how to write because yeah, that's something that Pramoedya sometimes uh, not talking about how his influence to younger writers. For example, I started to try to find out how his tendency to toward realisms and so to try to find out what kind of writer influenced him. And I found out maybe he himself not talking much about other writers as far as I know, but like sometimes he translate John Steinbeck novels like Of Mice and Men. There is a Pramoedya version, translated versions of Mice and Men. And I think he read a lot of Steinbeck, and so I try to find out how because Steinbeck is one of realist writer from America, and I found out that the simple language and based on the reality is something I think there's a give Pramoedya influence a lot. Of course, there is another writer like Maxim Gorky who Pramoedya used to talk a lot. And of course, the modern surrealisms, the socialist and progressive ideology influence more in Pramoedya works. Although the only his view on is entirely in speech of manuscript, there is a manuscript in his speech in University of Indonesia, Indonesian Literature and Socialist Realism Literature, letter being published, I think, in 2000s, around 2000, being published as a book. But before that is only kind of manuscript. I think as a writer, learns a lot from this those to approach realism and socialism, and that's what I try to write in my study essay for my study in philosophy department in Gajah Mada University. Next slide. So now I want to share what I found in his work that I already wrote in my book in Pramoedya Ananta Toer and Social Realism's Literature. Pramoedya once said that literary work must based on reality. I think that how come he not only his style in realism, but I think the source of the story is very important too. I try to split his work in three periods because I think it's very important to know how he progressed from one period to others, and at the same time maybe I can as a writer maybe we can learn a lot how this approach is can work in creative writings. First, the first period is work merely based on his own life experience. Is come from his early stage of his career. This include like Cerita dari Blora in English. I think the title is All That Is Gone, and then Perburuan. Cerita di Blora is almost all the is short story collection. Almost all the story is based on his own life in Blora. Blora is his hometown, and like experience when he was his childhood, and he comments on his nanny, his neighbor, his family, and then Perburuan in English translation I think is fugitive. Is based on his own experience in the revolution era in before and after the Indonesian independence in 1945. And then dari penjara ke penjara, I don't know if there is English version or not, is his experience in the uh, I think it's in the 40s when he was imprisoned by the Dutch. So he like sketch story about his own inmate experience and his own. So in this first period, a lot of semi-biographical works he wrote. I think it's maybe it's kind of he's still very young at the time. So I think it happens to almost all our writer that we wrote something that we already know, we already experienced. And the second period is around 50 and early 60 that when Pramoedya start to joining Lembaga Kebudayaan Rakyat, this Popular Cultural Institute is like the cultural side of I think is there has no direct hierarchy, but is like a leftist and very close relationship with the Communist Party. His work were, of course, there is this in this period. I think not only based on his experience, his what he see, but start to see everything is in the point of view ideological. His work sometimes I think I myself think that is very provocative, such as 𝗦𝗫𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗵𝐺, who is I think has a little bit similar a theme with the Gadis Pantai, but with more I think but more provocative. And then there is sekali peristiwa di Banten Selatan who yes is actually first, I think it was intended being performed as a play, but and then wrote as a book. And then there is a lot of polemical essay in newspaper around that time that yes, it's very very sometimes in that times the language and the theme is very harsh and against the opposite ideology side. And the third period, I think, is this some very interesting period in the Pramoedya's work because he starts to research a lot about the Indonesian, not maybe the time we can say that Indonesian, but maybe the pre-Indonesian history, like in the I think is still at the line with his view that his work must be based on a reality, but this time not only his own experience, but based on Indonesian pre-Indonesian history, like that's we know the Gadis Pantai and then Bumi Manusia tetralogy. Arus balik that move long way to the maybe a few 100 before the Dutch colonial. So I think this very interesting how his view on the reality-based works at the same time the research and at the same time the political is like if I can being kind of Hegelian is like thesis and antithesis, and the third period is like a synthesis of all of them. So the next slide. So almost after all of these works, I try to find out some key topic of his work. There is a very obvious one. The first one is anti-feudalism and anti-colonialism. Is I think it's almost we can see it almost all of his work. Sometimes, like in the 𝗍𝗲𝘁𝗍𝗲 and tetralogy, these two tendencies collide to each other. And then the other key topic is the important role of women. There is a kind of here and there in his work, like in 𝗍𝗲 Ananta Toer in the novel 𝗍𝗲𝘁𝗍𝗶, and then of course the central character in 𝗏𝑕s Pantai. And I think it's the ones that maybe Pramoedya is don't know in outside Indonesia, that he works to in Kartini biography. Kartini is one of the early feminist writer in Indonesia. And he wrote like a 2 volume of her biography. And then we can find that they like Pramoedya promote like multiculturalism. So I think there is some that very rare we talk about this, because like in Indonesia, we usually some writer is tend to write about his own culture, like if Japanese writer is for two Japanese, and sometimes the Sumatran they write a lot to Sumatran and everything. But if we read Pramoedya, sometimes we see like a very flowery, like we found out the Arab Indonesian, Chinese Indonesians, and there is in tetralogy the Pramoedya bring us to the story in how the Aceh fight the Dutch and the Balinese, and even in like all the child of all nations, he start to more broad to view the world in very different perspective, like how the China independent movement and Japanese and et al. So there is one that I'm very interesting is egalitarianism in the earth, this earth of mankind. He talked a lot about how Minke choose the use of Malay language and is the origin of Indonesian language because of its egalitarian nature. So I think it's one of theme that I wrote in my book about Pramoedya, how Pramoedya as a Japanese and who native Japanese speaker choose like a Minke. He choose to learn Indonesian and write Indonesian because it is nature. And there is a maybe it's a little bit minor in this last key is advocacy for science. I think the most interesting in this earth of mankind is how he talk about the technology, about the wheel, about the press printing. I think is very interesting because I think when I read some of his book that deal with some folklore, like there is about like arus balik, no, the Arok Dedes, and then is is he try to demystify all the folk tales, so it's more reasoning and more fact based, yeah, I think he don't like the mythic of the folklore. So the last slide, I think so. What I learned from Pramoedya in this 100 years of Pramoedya is that for him, the literary must and always be very political, and literature is a place for us to continue imagine the society we want. In the context of Pramoedya and me, maybe it's Indonesia, and one of the I think is I don't write it here. That after 80, after he was released from 𝗍𝗶𝘁𝗶𝗹, I can assure that Pramoedya didn't write anything against after that. I think his last book is 𝗍𝗏𝗡, Arus Balik, and everything he came from. So I think there is a very big hole in Indonesian history that Pramoedya didn't write. Is the I think we don't have especially fictions. We don't have what if Pramoedya wrote a novel about Soeharto era, because he lived all the time until 2000. So I think it's maybe it's our obligation, my generation, to feel the whole how we can write about those era, and then after that, yeah, after Reformation era, because that's I think that's what Pramoedya left us. Thank you for the times.
Yeah. Thanks, Eka, for the, I think, very comprehensive overview of Pramoedya's life and work. When I was an undergraduate student in UP, we also had a course on Jose Rizal, also a great novelist, a great Asian novelist, and also a political activist who was in the end executed for his writings, for his political anti-colonial writings. And it really struck me that there was a lot of resonance between Jose Rizal and Pramoedya Ananta Toer. It was like as if I was looking at someone like Jose Rizal, who was just over there in Indonesia. But it's a pity that, that there's nothing like a course in Pramoedya's life and works in Indonesia. Because in the Philippines, this is required. We have Jose Rizal's life and works in college. And we have the chance to discuss anti-colonial ideas, his progressive ideas, and anti-colonial struggle, and his novels. But it's quite different in Indonesia. That there is nothing like that. We can get back to that later. We'll just go to our next speaker now, who doesn't need much introduction here in the Philippines. She's Conchitina Chingbee Cruz, a professor at the Department of English and Comparative Literature, University of the Philippines, Diliman. She received her PhD in English from State University of New York, Albany. She is the author of the poetry books Dark Hours, Elsewhere Held and Lingered, There is No Emergency, and Modus. And she has written several investigations also into Philippine literary history. And I think part of it she will be sharing with us. So go ahead, Chingbee.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Woman, for the introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to spend an afternoon talking about Pramoedya and with this wonderful group. So I would like to I've been tasked to talk a bit about Pramoedya's presence in the Philippine literary scene. And thanks to Bowman also, who kind of prodded me in this direction. I am going to do that specifically by focusing on the 1995 Ramon B Awards, when Pramoedya was one of the awardees. So I will begin with a passage on the screen, which is from a lecture prepared by Pramoedya for the 𝗍𝗏𝗂 Awards. To what extent, and let me just read, to what extent can literature endanger the safety of the state? In my opinion, no literary oeuvre, in this case stories, can ever be a threat to any state. The stories are written with proper attribution to the author. It is clear where the story originates, and it is also clear that the story is the product of one person, an individual without any private army, secret police, nor hired assassins. At best, a story, a literary oeuvre, disturbs the peaceful slumber of those who dream of power without end. And These words are coming from a writer who at this point had been deprived by the Suharto regime of his freedom for 30 years, detained without trial for 14, and under town arrest for 16. His home taken from him, his papers destroyed. And this is, as we could see from Eka's really illuminating discussion also, this Pramoedya was also imprisoned during other periods, but this is in reference of what I'm referring to specifically is the detention under Suharto. Despite the cost to his life of his work, I was struck by these words because here was a sober appraisal of literature as a form of intervention. Its contribution to social change relatively modest. That is, at best, its capacity to haunt those with unchecked power. And so my talk focuses on the occasion that prompted the writing of these words, which is the Ramon Magsaysay Awards, as well as the controversy that erupted as a result of Pramoedya's selection as an awardee. The controversy is an interesting juncture at which the literary worlds of Indonesia and the Philippines converged, with Indonesian and Filipino writers weighing in on whether Pramoedya should be honored, and with this particular award. It seemed from the polemics that ensued that the haunting that Pramoedya saw as literature's modest capacity was fiercely playing out, that a peaceful slumber was being disturbed by the valuing of a writer of Pramoedya's kind, political, committed. For this talk, I primarily looked through the Philippine media coverage of the controversy during the run-up to and after the awards ceremony. So this was July to September 1995. So I looked at the news, opinion columns, editorials, letters to the editor, even society and gossip pages were talking about this. The tensions among Indonesian writers resurfaced by Pramoedya's award controversy are embedded in enduring questions regarding the relationship of literature and politics, the role of literature in nation building, the stakes of writing as a form of resistance, and the contentious and necessary work of reckoning with writing as a form of complicity. These matters, of course, resonate with Filipino writers whose own history of colonization and authoritarian regimes necessitates engagement with the same questions. So this is from the images from the Ramon Magsaysay Foundation website. So begun in 1958, the Ramon Magsaysay Awards is often described as Asia's Nobel Prize. Up to the time of Pramoedya's selection, there were 5 categories. And Pramoedya was named that year as the awardee for the category of journalism, literature, and creative communication arts. So you can see on the screen, this is part of the foundation's press release. In electing Pramoedya Ananta Toer to receive the 1995 Magsaysay Award, the Board of Trustees recognizes his illuminating with brilliant stories the historical awakening and modern experience of the Indonesian people. So in the press statement that the foundation released, they noted, among other things, how Pramoedya's fiction is not political in any narrow sense, that it concerns itself with social justice as well as the struggle against historical evils of foreign rule and indigenous feudalism. They noted too how his portrayal of women, mentioned also earlier, was notable, and how his work was quintessentially Indonesian while also embodying the universal human condition. The statement also provided a brief biography of Pramoedya that highlighted his dissident work as a writer and the suppression and loss suffered as a result. And here I'd like to note that Pramoedya, in his response to the award announcement, expressed its relevance in, quote, helping illuminate the fate of hundreds and thousands of people like myself. And so he was referring to the million killed, the tens of thousands jailed by Suharto's New Order regime in order to decimate the mass movement for socialism. Okay. So upon the award announcement, the controversy immediately followed. There was a statement of protest issued by 26 Indonesian writers, led by Mokhtar Lubis, who was the first Indonesian awardee of the 𝗦𝗍𝗍 Awards for the same category as Pramoedya. So Pramoedya was the second in 1995, while Lubis received the award in its first year, 1958. Another prominent writer who was part of the protest was 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝘁, literary critic, who received also the 𝗦𝗍𝗍 Award in 1987 for public service. So as you can see, so this is just a part of the statement that they issued. We believe the foundation is not fully aware of the notorious role of Pramoedya in the darkest period for artistic creativity during the guided democracy years, 59 to 65, in witch hunting his fellow writers who happened to be on the other side of the fence. This was the period mentioned by 𝗦𝗊𝗁 earlier, but the second period of the kind of antithesis, if you will, of Pramoedya's writing. So the statement was quite, it made a lot of accusations. So it said that Pramoedya engaged in smear campaign and character assassination, in suppressing the freedom of expression, and all in all, leading in the oppression on creativity of non-communist writers and artists. It also said that Pramoedya never publicly regretted or admitted these actions, even as the writers he suppressed then are now advocating for the restoration of his rights. Lubis went so far as to fly to the Philippines to personally return his 𝗦𝗍𝗍 Award in protest of Pramoedya's. This occurred at around the same time as the award ceremony. Lubis was able to go to the Philippines to protest the award, while Pramoedya was unable to go to the Philippines to receive it. He was not allowed to travel by the Indonesian government. So this was how the controversy started, and there were a lot of discourse was produced through the newspapers and magazines in the Philippines at the time, and government officials from Indonesia and the Philippines weighed in. The Indonesian ambassador to the Philippines, Peter Demanik, said the position of Indonesia is consistent with the statement of the 26 writers who protested the award. Indonesian foreign minister at the time, Ali Alatas, also echoed this position, saying it was an unfortunate choice to honor Pramoedya, someone who was in the forefront of communist propaganda and the fight to kill democracy. These concerns reached the Philippine Senate floor. At the time, Senator Leticia Chahani said, and I quote, "I just hope that in this difficult period of peace, when Indonesia is playing a major role for the national interest of the Philippines, while it's important to recognize human geniuses, this 𝗦𝗍𝗍 Award will not cause new problems in bilateral relations with an important neighbor." So at the time, Shahani was referring to to Indonesia's third-party role in the ongoing peace talks with the MNLF, and also referring to the previous year's tensions with Indonesia caused by an international conference held in Manila by NGOs denouncing the continued occupation of Indonesia by Indonesia of East Timor. So there was, even in the run-up to the award, speculation on whether then President Fidel Ramos should attend the event. People in the gossip columns were watching, like, will he attend or will he not attend? And it was specifically in light of this controversy. Well, now, okay, the second quote upon the screen. So The biggest supporter of the protest in the Philippines was Lubis's fellow Cold Warrior 𝗩𝗏𝗀𝗃, also a 𝗩𝗂𝗍𝗂 awardee in 1980. Various newspapers published 𝗩𝗏𝗀𝗃's statement at around the same time that the statement of the Indonesian writers was being published also here, in which he echoed their accusations. Jose said that, addressing the foundation, it should be obvious by now, this award is not simply about literary merit. He said that Pramoedya was an insult to the democratic ideals of 𝗩𝗂𝗍𝗂. He also said that Pramoedya was fortunate that in 1965 he was imprisoned, not killed. 𝗩𝗏𝗀𝗃 also said, he said a lot of things, that in banning Pramoedya's work, Suharto was playing into the hands of the communist sympathizers and perpetuating the myth of Pramoedya's heroic martyrdom. Aside from his initial statement, 𝗩𝗏𝗀𝗃 continued to write about this controversy as it was ongoing. So at some point, he likened Pramoedya to Marcos supporters. And so that's why he said Filipinos need to pay attention to what's going to happen here, because maybe in the future, writers who supported Marcos will also be honored with this award. And then at some point, compared Pramoedya to Marcos himself. Okay, so well, the 𝗩𝗂𝗍𝗂 Foundation issued, of course, a response in which it stood by and defended its decision. And then I'll talk a bit also about how Filipino writers also weighed in. So, but in some, those protesting the award, and among them some of the staunchest anti-communist writers pre-1965, were disputing the leftist writer Pramoedya's worthiness of recognition, let alone from an award-giving body named after a reader in the crusade against communism. And so in news sound bites, there were representatives of the foundation who spoke in response, and generally the tenor was to say that there's a separation between literature and politics. Emphasizing that the choice was for literary achievements and there were no political considerations. However, and this is what I have on the screen, the longer foundation press statement did offer a more complex account of its decision, even as it expressed regret for disappointing their former awardees. And so, well, part of the statement was to restate the literary merit of Pramoedya's writing, especially the 𝗏𝗏 quartet, noting its complexity and originality in imagining the Indonesian nation. And while it acknowledged Pramoedya's participation in the polemics of the time, pre-1965, which, as the statement said, was a time of excesses on both sides. Pramoedya's personal role in the excesses of the left is a matter of bitter dispute. He certainly paid a price for his identification with Indonesia's communist movement. On the screen, I have just some statements, some lines from the foundation statement also, addressing the contradiction that the critics of the award flagged. It's true that Ramon Magsaysay despised communism, but he never sought to stigmatize permanently those who had joined the communist movement or who, like Pramoedya, joined and or supported leftist organizations. The foundation believes it should behave no differently. And it respects Pramoedya's dogged commitment in the years of his internment to write fiction that illuminates for Indonesians important elements of their identity and history. The earlier presentation talked about the quartet and this as a kind of synthesis of Pramoedya's literary history, and so it references that the novels that he wrote while in detention. It has concluded, moreover, that this achievement in the face of personal loss and prolonged deprivation does indeed comport with, and this is the major criterion for the award, greatness of spirit shown in service to the people. Okay. So Filipino writers responded to the controversy. As I already mentioned earlier, 𝗩𝗶𝘁𝗶𝘶 was most prominent, in tandem also with Max Sullivan, who was a publisher of Philippine Star. The media coverage here did laud that Indonesian writers also issued support for Pramoedya's award, particularly a statement issued by 154 Indonesian writers, journalists, and activists. But I'd like to just do a quick description of several of the strains of concurrence from Filipino writers, now with the Foundation's choice to recognize Pramoedya. So the first strain argued for the separation of art and artist. It's represented, for instance, by Conrado de Quiros and Alfred Yuson. The general logic of the defense was, if the award is for literature, then the only standard is literary merit. So the basis for this argument, it seemed, was less an engagement with Pramoedya and his work, and more a pre-existing belief in the separation of art and artist that happened to find an occasion for expression in the controversy. Now, the second type of response, concurring with the correctness of honoring Pramoedya, did not separate art and artist, and so held as deeply connected and equally admirable, both Pramoedya and his work. And an example of this is 𝗍𝗏𝗏, who won the 𝗩𝗏𝗂𝗃 Award in 1993. So of course, in the polemics of the time, people were also citing, like, where the kind of where they're coming from, So awardees former awardees were protesting the award, and then former awardees were also supporting it. 𝗍𝗏𝗏 framed his defense as one who values literature for and about the masses. And so he lauded Pramoedya's work as the artistic representation of his political vision. And he also stated that Pramoedya has not, by his political activism, incurred any blood debt. Now, the third strain, which then this is where I drew some quotes from, is from Risil Mojares, who wrote several essays during and after the award ceremony on Pramoedya. Like 𝗏𝗏𝗏, Mojares regarded Pramoedya's life and work as intertwined, and saw the accusations regarding his polemics during the period in question as excessive. But it was Mojares who saw the controversy as a teaching moment for Filipinos generally unfamiliar with the literature of a neighbor country. Well, Bowman has also contextualized earlier how, to this day, there's not production here in relation to Pramoedya's work is not enough. So at the time, Mojares already noted this, and he took the time in writing to provide some context for the controversy. I should mention that Mojares at the time was on the board of trustees of the 𝗩𝗏𝗂𝗃 Foundation. And in some of the coverage, Pramoedya's nomination was being attributed to him. From Mojares' point of view, well, we have here now, the controversy revived the Cold War animosities of the early 1960s. The highly charged rhetoric has preserved the acrimony that attended the Indonesian debates of the early 1960s. It is as well expressive of the process of the demonization of communism, which sought to erase the Sukarno legacy in Indonesia's political and cultural life. Okay, so just to now how kind of Mojares tried to elaborate on this. Now he he discussed the cultural debates happening during the period of Sukarno's guided democracy concerning the relationship of literature and nation building, and how from these discussions there was clear opposition between universal humanism with its liberal democratic values and socialist realism, which was anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist. Pramoedya was, of course, on the side of the latter and wrote forcefully about it. Mojares underscored how these political debates were entangled. These literary debates were entangled in the political struggle of the time. Pramoedya was part of the left-wing organization 𝗩𝗏RA, which was affiliated with the PKI. And while the anti-𝗩𝗏RA artisan intellectuals, on the other hand, had the support of the army. And with Suharto's takeover in 1965 came brutal consequences for Pramoedya and the cultural left, the impact of which by the time of this award had already spanned 13 years, which is quite a long period of time for this project of demonization and erasure that Mojares speaks of. Okay, so I'm heading towards wrapping up. So this is my last slide. This process that Mojares referred to now, which involved mass murder, incarceration, black propaganda against Sukarno and the left, bans on progressive writing. Well, that is the violent elimination of the vision of Indonesia represented by Pramoedya and the left. Was also a sustained and systematic depoliticization of culture. The controversy stirred by Pramoedya's 𝗩𝗂𝗍𝗍 Award in reprising the acrimony from the literary debates in the years immediately preceding the New Order from the vantage point of 30 years later certainly compels a reckoning with the actions of writers at the time and also the time after. So for instance, we might also ask what role literary production played in the demonization and erasure that Mojares speaks of. For us in the Philippines, we have our own reckonings to deal with, to confront and comprehend literary complicity with the brutal regimes of, say, Marcos or Duterte. So that's a lot, but for now, I'd like to end with Pramoedya's own final words in his 𝗩𝗂𝗍𝗍 lecture, which he did not deliver. Another writer, or 𝗩𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 delivered it for him. And so I will end with the final words in his 𝗩𝗂𝗍𝗍 lecture, as I think it resonates with his work. So toward the end of his speech, Pramoedya reiterates the connection of literature and politics, saying there's no separating them, as there's no society disentangled from the relations of power. And he ends by affirming quite plainly the firm commitment to literature's modest capacity to disturb the peace of power without end. As he puts it, the literature that rejects politics, that professes to be wholly apolitical, is obviously produced by those writers who have found a comfortable niche in the halls of power. While those who call for progress and justice, even if they have to wander through a lonely wilderness of rejection and misunderstanding, continue to tell their stories. A vision of the world as a place where all can stand straight and keep their heads high and live in full humanity. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Chingbee. I think the discussion is getting really hotter now. It's getting more and more exciting. And I'd just like to make a comment about that. Racil Mojares is a Philippine national artist. He's a very, very important intellectual here in the Philippines. He's a historian, and he's a literary critic. And I think at one time, when he was just beginning his project to get a doctorate degree, he had gotten a grant from Fulbright to study Indonesian literature in Indonesia. And if you look at the books in the Asian Center with the Indonesian language books, he borrowed those books in the early 70s. His name is on the cards, on the borrower's cards, and he was prevented from traveling to Indonesia because of his activist background under the Marcos regime. So it was unfortunate that one of our best scholars was prevented from undertaking a study of or a comprehensive study of Indonesian literature. But in the end, he ended up studying Philippine literature, which is also very important for for us scholars in literature in the Philippines, right? So that's one twist of fate. Now we go to our next and last speaker. It's my honor to introduce to you Dr. Max Lane, who is the translator of Indonesian literary works by Pramoedya Ananta Toer, the 𝗍𝗁𝗏 Quartet, and by the poet playwright Rendra. He is author of Unfinished Nation, Indonesia Before and After Suharto, 2008, Catastrophe in Indonesia, 2010, Decentralization and its Discontents, an essay in class, political agency and national perspective in Indonesian politics, 2014, Introduction to the Politics of the Indonesian Union Movement from 2019, Indonesia Out of Exile, how Pramoedya's 𝗍𝗁𝗏 Quartet killed a dictatorship, very recently in 2023, Indonesia and Not Anecdotes Scattered, also 2023, and Saudara Berdiri di Pihak Yang Mana, 𝗩𝗁𝗏𝗶𝗁𝗏 Rendra. So a book about the writings of Rendra in 2024. He's also a senior visiting fellow at 𝗍𝗁𝗁𝗐's 𝗩𝗍𝗂 Institute. In his 50-year engagement with Indonesia and Southeast Asia, he has been a diplomat, writer, academic, and activist, an experience which has confronted him with the realities of the colonized world. So thank you, Max, for coming, and we can begin with your lecture or talk now.
You needed to be unmuted.
Yes.
Yes, that often helps other people to hear what one has to say. Okay, well, my topic, the topic given me was the position or influence or role of Pramoedya Ananta Toer's works in Southeast Asian social movements. Well, to be honest, beyond Indonesia, I can't really comment on his role or influence in Singapore or Malaysia or Thailand or the Philippines. So maybe in discussion, the friends in those countries can make comments. Although I will make just a little side comment, which I think is quite interesting, is that when This Earth and Mankind was first published in the early 1980s, it was published jointly by Penguin Australia and Penguin UK. And the world was divided amongst the different Penguin companies according to the position of countries in the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth. And so Penguin United Kingdom also was responsible for selling that book in Singapore. And the demand was so big in Singapore for the book, they had to do a separate print run of almost quite a lot. I forget the exact number, quite a large print run for Singapore. So there was definitely an interest in Singapore, and there still is. But I don't know that there's enough of what you might call a social movement in Singapore to use that as a kind of interesting subject for discussion. But in Indonesia, of course, I would argue that his works did have a particular role, although not in every period of time, not all the time, differing from one period to another period. And in this thing, I would have to say that the quotation put up by Professor Cruz of his or stories don't have much influence was a somewhat disingenuous statement by him, I think, put forward in a very defensive role. Or all I'm doing is writing a story. What are you people all upset about? But I was in Indonesia in 1980 and 81 for almost those whole 2 years when the books came out, and I can tell you, everybody involved, Pramoedya and his publishers, were always constantly considering what impact the publication, what positive impact the publication of the books might make. Of course, factually, he's correct. The text itself does not get up, walk around, and influence people. The text, the novels, the story have an impact to the extent to which they're part of an overall cultural praxis. And certainly the group, Pramoedya, 𝗩𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂 cultural practice that related to the publication of these books. When Pramoedya, Hashim Rahman, and Yusuf Ishak arranged to meet with the Vice President of Indonesia, 𝗩𝗏𝗧𝗏 Malik, for a photo opportunity, where 𝗩𝗏 Malik made the announcement that every child at school in Indonesia should read this book, so they knew what their parents had to struggle against. That was part of a praxis, literary or cultural practice, which did have a significant impact to get Suharto's vice president to make a statement that your book written in prison on Buru Island should be compulsory reading for everybody, was the beginning, or part, not the beginning, but one element in a process of eroding and subverting the strength or the hold of the previous 15 years of black propaganda on certain elements in Indonesian society, in particular young people. 1981, I visited Pramoedya's house regularly, and there were always young people visiting, always wanting to talk to him. And it wasn't just him they wanted to talk to. Having read his books and having talked to him, they wanted to talk to other people who came back from Pulau Buru as well. So there was, for the first time in 15 years, an alternative voice, an alternative perspective on what had happened in Indonesia before 1965, during 1965 and since. Because this is one thing that's, I think, even in the Philippines where you had Marcos, something difficult to, not always easy to grasp, but that between 1965 and 1979, 1980, 1981, there were no alternative voices, full stop, exclamation mark. There were alternative voices in the sense of critical of Suharto's corruption, abuse of power, but in terms of the history of what happened before 65, why the new order of Suharto had come about was needed in the first place, there were no alternative voices. There was a monopoly. And you could almost say that in the ideological sphere, especially the ideology of history, it was a totalitarian situation. So the publication of Pramoedya's books had this subversive impact in two ways. First, it delivered a strong dent to the black propaganda that all communists, everyone in Pulau Buru, were atheists, evil, rapists, murderers. The black propaganda around the torture and sexual torment of the generals who were shot dead back in 1965 was really it was that color, that kind of tone that really was dominant in all of the anti-communist propaganda. So young people, young students would read the books, and not only young students, also all sorts of people actually would read the books and come to the conclusion, hey, I thought everyone on Pulau Buru were evil, evil doers. Whoever wrote this book, 𝗩𝗏𝗀𝗶𝗹 Manusia, that is Pramoedya Ananta Toer, is obviously a deeply humanist person with enormous empathy for a whole range of different kinds of human beings. That was the first erosion of the black propaganda. The black propaganda had labeled all these people, because you have to remember, I don't know, I think it's even different from the Philippines, but it's certainly different from in the West, where anti-communist propaganda is very nuanced. It uses half-truths. complicated arguments to criticize, portray communist ideology and communist experience in a very negative way. A lot of half truths, nuanced half truths, etc. In Indonesia, no. It was extremely black and white. Communists were evil. That's it. And they had that binatang 𝗍𝗶𝘁𝗶𝗹, which portrayed the communist women as whoring, bloodthirsty, sex orgy killers, and the Communist Party is sneaky and negative in every way. And here comes Pramoedya, allegedly one of them, who can write a book like 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗃. And I remember being there when the book came out, that people would come around to, not to Pramoedya's house so much, but would come around to the publisher's house, just anybody from all social classes, to buy extra copies because they'd just fallen in love with the book. They wanted to buy extra copies for their friends, including even from the prosecutor's office. I sneaked around to the 𝗍𝗶𝗃 office to buy extra books. So that was point one. Point two was that, and this is something still relevant today, but in a different way. But I think, and it's hard to print out, it's hard to prove, it's hard to document. But I think the characters in 𝗍𝗀𝘀𝗀, Minka, in the Minka character in Volume 1 and Volume 2, and also 𝗍𝗫𝗁𝗁, and all of the positive characters, and then 𝗍𝗫𝘁𝗁𝗁 Adisurio in 𝗍𝗫𝗁𝗁 and 𝗩𝗶𝘁𝗁. Their characters, their kepribadian, their character, their strength of character, was just a total contrast with the nature and personality of all of the membership of the political, social, and business elite that dominated Indonesia under Suharto. Corruption, cronyism, decadence on the one hand, and then Nyai Antosoro, Minka, Tito Adisurio, Jean Moray, all of them on the other. And I think that contrast between the two sets of values, including the ones that Eka referred to earlier, egalitarianism, importance of science, etc. The contrast was another thing which had a big psychological impact amongst those young people who got to read it. We always have to have this in proportion, because the percentage of young people who got to read Pramoedya's books was tiny, still is tiny. So, but that tiny group had a big impact on that tiny group. And there's the third one too, I should add. If not so much in 1981, but when I was back in Indonesia, 1990, 91, 92, 93, that period, and talking to activists who were playing a leading role in organizing the opposition to Suharto, they're all used, especially 𝗍𝗫𝗁𝗁 and 𝗩𝗶𝘁𝗁. They're inspired by the whole war. They were inspired by Pramoedya, Yusuf Ishak and Hashim's courage in publishing these books, with about Karya Pura-Buru on the front cover within a year of coming from prison under Suharto, at a time when Suharto's repression was at its height. They were inspired by the books themselves and by this example. But they also would often talk how they used the discussion of how the various mass organizations that Tito Adisurio, TRS, was involved in, Syarikat Priai, Syarikat Dagang Islam, how the politics of editing the newspaper, Medan Priai, how they studied that and how they drew lessons from that in their own organizing work during the 1990s. So often we'd be sitting down and they'd be quoting or referring to incidents in those two books which they drew lessons from in their own practical organizing. So, my 2023 book, How Pramoedya's Buruh Quartet Killed the Dictatorship, I hold very firmly to that it played a very big role. Not the book itself, as I said, books don't get up and walk around by themselves, but inspiring providing inputs, material, thinking that were taken up by the vanguard of the movement against Suharto was very important. But then we come to the period after Suharto's fell. What's its role today? I think here it's a few interesting factors that come into play. First of all, I have to just talk about the basic fact that still not many, it's 270 million people in Indonesia, 150, there's close to 200 million adults now, people over 16 or 17. What percentage of those have heard of Pramoedya or read Pramoedya's books is extremely tiny. That's fact 1-to-1. And of course, it's even much tinier than it should be, because as 𝗍𝗁𝗶𝗹 said, you don't study it in Indonesia, not in university, not in college or high school. No literature is studied. 𝗍𝗁𝗶𝗃, I believe, was on a committee earlier or sometime during the course of last year, trying to get some key Indonesian literary books, at least some statement that list of books should be, the teachers should encourage that they be read in the school. But there's still no subject in Indonesian high schools Indonesian literature. You're not from junior high school to senior high school. There's no process where you're encouraged to read and debate novels, drama, plays, and poems. And that would be a very subversive process if it ever started. So first you have to note the books are, while they're available in all bookshops now, they're not, within the big picture, they're not widely read. But are they being widely read amongst enough people to be another vanguard, as occurred in the 80s, in particular the 1990s? I was in Jakarta in February, and one thing that pleasantly surprised me, was that around the country, I was also in other parts of Java, that around the country there were so many commemorations of Pramoedya. I think just from my own Facebook timeline, I was able to download 40 or 50, and that's based on the algorithm that selects material for me. And I'm not on Instagram. I don't look at TikTok. I suspect very much if we had a full picture of how many commemoration activities were going on, there would be, a very, very large number. And if you think about it, where else in the world on the 100th anniversary of one of a country's writers, you would get scores and scores of self-initiated commemoration activities? You would not get that in Australia. I doubt whether, in 100 or 150 years or whatever it is, or Steinbeck or whatever, you're not going to get the same phenomenon. You're not going to get the same phenomenon. I spoke at a few of these events. I spoke at one in Jakarta. There are 400 people present. But I noticed later on the various streaming services, YouTube and Facebook and others, where footage of that event was not only me speaking, it was others speaking as well. There were thousands of people who viewed it. Thousands. Of course, in a country of 200 million, thousands is not proportionally a lot, but it's a very important sign, I think, as the beginning of a process. So there's certainly an interest there, but the question is, what are people taking from Pramoedya's books at this point in time? I think in terms of what people take from it politically, in terms of how it might feed into a social movement or precisely a political movement, what they take from it is essentially framed at the moment by the nature of the alienation between layers of young people, I think the whole population in some way, but more intensely in some layers of young people, and other people who have a history of activism as well, is the alienation from the current, the ruling class, the social elite, call it whatever term you want to use, that's evolved over the last 20 years. symbolized by Joko Widodo and now by President Prabowo Subianto. Corruption, decadence. I mean, it's. I left Indonesia after spending a month or so there in, I think, late February or something. But during late February into March, the corruption scandals have been just one after another, after another, after another. And then sudden decisions by the government to cut budgets, build, then exaggerated claims about what the food estates will. The alienation amongst young people, certain layers of young people, and this corrupt, arrogant elite. That alienation finds an echo, not an echo, that's not quite the right word. The alienation finds an answer, a pole of attraction in the strength of character of key characters in the Buru Quartet novels. 𝗦𝗫 Tosoro, Minka, all of the positive characters. We want an Indonesia with those types of people in leading the country, not the crap that we have at the moment. I think that's hard to prove that with documentary way. So in some ways, it's more of a gut feel talking to all of the young people involved in these commemorations and so on. But for me, the interesting thing is that one of the most fundamental and important aspects of the Buru Quartet has not yet had the impact it needs to have a real to play a role in actually changing consciousness to the level that you can see the movement move to the higher level of struggle. Eka in his talk about how Pramoedya was multicultural, had a multicultural orientation. I wouldn't use that term myself. I would say he's monocultural. Pramoedya is monocultural. Of course, Bumi Manusia, as Eka also said, is pre-Indonesian. But Pramoedya himself, the novels, not so much I agree with the point that Eka made about how Pramoedya deals with all the different, Aceh, Bali, Madura, whatever. But the novels themselves are monocultural, that is Indonesian. Yeah, Indonesian. And I think one of the crucial aspects of the Buru Quartet is the extent to which they contribute to an understanding how the nation itself can have agency, or the people that constitute the nation as a nation can have agency. And this is quite interesting because in most unsophisticated, I know the old term when I was a younger student would be vulgar Marxism. The vulgar Marxist precept is only class plays a significant role as agency for change. But of course, if you read all the material written by the Bolsheviks in the beginning of the 20th century, they talked about nation all the time, self-determination of nations. That assumes that the nation itself has a reality and can be have agency. And I think that's part of also the what can be taken from Pramoedya's works as well, that the people that constitute the nation, which is a real material object, not something just somehow imagined, but a real experienced material object constituted in the end by its people, can change things and can even create something that did not exist on planet Earth before. That is in this particular case, Indonesia. The word didn't exist because the reality didn't exist. And the reality only developed in the end because of the agency of the people that came to constitute it right through 1945 up until 1965. So recovering the idea that agency, even if it's certain class forces which will play a leadership role within that nation, recovering that sense of agency as a nation is, I think, one of the things which I hope people will start writing about in Indonesia as they interpret Pramoedya's works. Now, in the most recent demonstrations still ongoing in Indonesia, there's the term that's being used all the time to describe people's sentiment is Indonesia gelap, Indonesia dark. I think that's a very important, in some ways, new term. 1 or 2 years ago, it was reformasi di korupsi. Now the reference is to Indonesia itself. And I think until the political social movement starts to think of how to change the whole country, the ferment that's taking place now will remain unfinished. And I think a lot can be learnt about the origins of the Indonesian nation, even before it existed, can be learnt from Pramoedya's books. The negative side of Indonesia gelap is the other one, kabur aja dulu, leave the country. So I think the question of the nation itself is being put more on the table. Will some people start to talk about Pramoedya's novels, revive the nation by talking, look, here are books which explain where we all came from, even before the reality had started to concretize itself in the 1910s, 20s, 30s. Here is where we came from, and the cultural values connected to our origins are the opposite of the cultural values of the current elite, and the kind of cultural values we want to see adopted in the country. So I think there's a vacuum there, something which has not been taken from Pramoedya yet. Strength of character, yes, you can find on the web, on people's T-shirts, even on the back of trucks, quotes from Pramoedya's works, so many of them, but they all relate to the question of strength of character. What lied behind 𝗍𝗫 strength of character? What lied behind Minka's evolution as a human being with a very strong strength of character and commitment to his ideals? So I think we're still waiting for that, and probably it's connected. Books, as I said, they don't get up and walk by themselves. There needs to be a praxis that interconnects the text with society, and society also needs itself be at a certain stage where sections of that society will be receptive to interacting with the text. Texts aren't magic. They are part of a process, part of a praxis. So I think we will still be waiting some time. Well, I don't know how long, next week, next month, next year, I don't know, before that intersection starts to happen in a fuller way. But all those scores of activities commemorating Pramoedya give me heart. To me, they point in the direction that we will see something happen. It's just a matter of time. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max, for that very engaging discussion about, you hear that there are hundreds of commemorations in Indonesia of Pramoedya Ananta Toer. I think that's not possible in other countries. Also in the Philippines, I've never seen anything like that. So it shows us that there's a great hunger, a great thirst among the younger people for understanding Pramoedya. Before I go into the Q&A, there might be some questions here in the online. I want to read some of the reactions to our discussion. So from one of our colleagues, Sol Iglesias, she quotes 𝗍𝗫. From Pramoedya's biography, we can draw a simple conclusion. Indonesia's history is one of violence, and imprisoning writers is one of the country's political languages. This is moving and profound, Sol says. Another one of our colleagues who's in Thailand now is 𝗩𝗶𝘁𝗶𝘶 Manzanilla, who said that imprisoning literary dissidents aimed to prevent the political contamination of the populace. The program backfired because it all the more challenged progressives to propagate subversive ideas in more innovative ways that eluded repression. So that is an observation by 𝗩𝗶𝘁 that when there is repression, then there is also a drive for people to avoid that repression, to go behind it, to go beyond it, and to read novels and literature that have been banned and suppressed. And I'm not so sure about the questions, whether we have any at the moment. But since we have a structure like a roundtable, maybe our speakers can also ask questions to each other. But before that, I'd like to ask a question which has which came up because of the various contributions that I heard this afternoon. So we heard from Eka how there was a very, very strong effort to erase Pramoedya, so that that he was only able to become acquainted with Pramoedya already in the 90s, and already he had already read such a lot of literature, but that sort of Pramoedya came towards the end. I remember that, for example, when I was giving a sort of lecture in Indonesia in a university, and my lecture was about Pramoedya. And after I delivered my lecture, the first question was, why are you talking about Pramoedya? Why did you discuss Pramoedya? So for me, that was a bit funny because, for me, it's taken for granted that, we have to study, we have to discuss Pramoedya. And it's not, why would you ask a question like that? Why are you discussing this great writer or that great writer? And that sort of, I had to explain why I even had to discuss Pramoedya in a university in Indonesia. And also during one of my early periods of research in UI, in the Universitas Indonesia, I went to their main library, and there was almost nothing by Pramoedya in that library. It was as if I was expecting that I could get all the stuff that I needed about Pramoedya in the Universitas Indonesia in their library, but there were only very few books, and those books were pre 1965. So the libraries were quite cleaned out. So there was this effort to erase, just erase Pramoedya from memory, from reading. And then I heard from Max Lin this question of the totally black and white representation, the kind of division in consciousness in Indonesia between the black and the white, where in the black, those who are in darkness, those who should be thrust into darkness, include people like Pramoedya, the leftists and the communists. And then we sort of looked at the kind of debate and dispute that happened in the Philippines with this sort of belated literary Cold War about which happened around the granting of the Magsaysay Award to Pramoedya. Now, my question is, if there are so many commemorations in Indonesia and perhaps elsewhere in the world, I also heard that there's one in France. It seems to me that those who are against Pramoedya are precisely those who emphasize his political nature, his very political nature. They bring his political positions to the fore, and that becomes part of their argument, a very strong part of their argument against Pramoedya himself. Whereas sometimes those defenders of Pramoedya are those who sort of reduce or minimize his politics, right? Who sort of say, no, he's not really a very political person, and his novels aren't really so. They're beautiful works of high aesthetic value, and they represent humanism and a great spirit. Yeah, so sometimes it's those defenders of Pramoedya who sort of reduce and sort of weaken the political aspect of his work. Even though I totally agree with what Eka said, that Pramoedya is essentially a political writer. But what is happening in these commemorations, in the many commemorations that are happening around Pramoedya? Maybe we can ask what we know about these commemorations. Are they commemorations which revive the political energy and thrust and emancipatory ideas of Pramoedya, or do they lapse into this kind of defensive position in which Pramoedya is a great humanist, he should be read by everyone. He's not exactly the best thing about him is the non-political aspect of his work, the things that make us feel human, right? So I want to ask our panelists, what do they think about this? That my observation that those who are against Pramoedya are primarily those who actually rub his politics in, right? While some
I think
defenders,
you're,
yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
okay,
you're,
well,
I think
that's-
you're, I think you're right, Bowman. It's also influenced the what texts have been translated for overseas, because there's a strong lobby in the United States that wanted to project Pramoedya as a liberal, and therefore, if we take the periodization that Eka put forward, they'd like to go back to the first period and translate those books into English, rather than even moving Manusia or anak semua bangsa. They have long screeds in it, long conversations in it, talking about how capital develops, etc., etc. As to commemorations now, I think, as I said, still the emphasis is on the humanist strength of character, being a proper human being kind of thing. But the thing is, today that becomes political, because it contrasts so much with the character of the current Indonesian ruling elite. So from my point of view, not enough politics has been taken out of, taken from Pramoedya's writings and from his thinking and from his record. But for the time being, at this particular conjuncture, that emphasis on character, being good human being, etc., is now connected with the idea of lawan, resist, fight back. So those two things are connected, but not at a high ideological level, but more at an instinctual level. But I think it's still a very important moment in the ferment that's going on. And and it's true that I think it's true that most of his opponents have concentrated on his politics, but of course obscure the context. In 1963, 64, 65, when Pramoedya wrote scathing polemics of what he called, basically the salon writers, he was scathing because his view, like many others, was that Indonesia was heading into a crisis where if the left did not win, the army would take over, the left will be killed, and the country will be handed over to foreign interests, which is exactly what has happened. So I think that context, that fear that people like Pramoedya had, that well-based fear that people like Pramoedya had back in before 1965, has to be taken into account. Eka, your turn.
Yes, I think the fact is our governments since the Suharto era, I think last until now, they is very successful to mix Indonesian peoples not talking much about politics. So something like the politicizations of our people. Even I think so when we talk about Pramoedya, sometimes there is a two kind of approach that first that some readers are really ignoring all the political aspect. So just because maybe some of them not not educated enough about the political situation in Indonesia, or maybe afraid of being political. So they just talk about his literary work, his aesthetic or history or anything else. But maybe there is some part of the readers who try to reach out other people who was afraid of the political aspect. So he just talk about that his literary aspect, especially for younger generations. But maybe it will be has to be changed nowadays, because like Max already told us in this few weeks here, Indonesian bank wake up against after the presidency of Prabowo. So and the commemorations of 100 years of Pramudia is like came in the right time, so people start to read it again and talk about its political aspect. I remember the times when I was in university and I proposed my undergraduate thesis about Pramudia in 1997, and my philosophy department reject it because of course the subject is Pramudia gitu. At that time, I don't care a lot because I really love Pramudia and start to write about him. I think that time that if the university reject it, I just want to write it as a book and so maybe publish it as next year or anything. But as we already know, early in 1998, Suharto fell down, and I proposed again that manuscript, and at that times they accept it because they said there is no Suharto again. So, but I think the whole situation is not thanks too much, because I think Max already told that last year I worked with the education's ministry to make a list Indonesian literature who has to read by students from the elementary to high school. And this, of course, include the Pramudia works because we think that it's very important for, especially for high school students, to read them. But we actually we have a lot of kind of rejections about that. Outside the other rejections, one of part, of course, the relationship between Pramudia and the leftist political. So I think under the surface, the Indonesian still anti-communism country, so until paranoid and still black and white. So even as legally Pramudia still can be read, can be sold, available in bookstore, but I think the majority of people still ignoring it, maybe. But I have to. I think it's yes, one of ours us to promote more to others, Indonesian people, to read his work.
Sorry, Chingbee, do you have a comment on that particular question?
Well, I suppose I can just say briefly, thinking specifically of how Pramudia was discussed in during the controversy regarding his award, that I do think that was an instance of this erasure and demonization being made visible as incomplete. The honoring of a writer who represented something that was quite violently erased. And I think that's why the arguments were so interesting, because truly the kind of the way to keep him visible was to insist that he was apolitical, or that we could appreciate, we could separate it. Now we can appreciate the work. We don't need to think about the person or what he did. No. Meanwhile, those who were protesting the award were, in light of like 30 years of depoliticization, we're now invoking, why are we talking about this political writer, and kind of, so there's a strange kind of shifting of logics in order to, you make him visible, but you defang the politics. And meanwhile, you strive to continue the erasure, which and it's very interesting to me to learn continuously how materially Pramoedya is being erased. The absence in libraries, the non-presence or little to no presence being taught in Indonesia, which is why all the more the story that was told by Dr. Max in his book on independent publishing, and how Hasamitra, that the necessity, it's not just the writer and his work. Then you do have to have this, you do have to have these other participants, in this instance, like this press put together by former political prisoners to make the work available to go against the bans, or kind of to like just constantly try to outwit the banning that's happening. And that in itself, it is not simply the literal words that are being said in the work, but the kind of collective effort to provide an alternative vision that is also not kind of not being made in order to like uplift like aesthetic achievement. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I just want to I just have this comment about Chingbee's talk earlier about 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗹 is one of the more well-known writers in the Philippines. His work has been translated to various languages also, and it was really I found it funny that when 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗃 was saying that awarding the prize to Pramoedya Ananta Toer is like awarding the prize, the Ramon Magsaysay Prize, to Marcos writers, pro-Marcos writers. It's kind of like the reverse, that he's referring to rightist, right? It's like in Indonesia, you would say that giving the prize to Pramoedya would be like honoring Mokhtar Lubis. Like that would be the same thing, this a supporter of the dictatorship, etc., who didn't fight against the dictatorship. So it's funny that 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝘃 didn't refer to leftist writers, as a negative example, So, for example, he didn't say that, giving the prize to Pramoedya Ananta Toer would be like giving the Ramon Magsaysay Prize to a Filipino communist. He wasn't saying that. In fact, he was saying that it would be like giving the prize to a supporter of the US-supported Marcos regime. So that's a quite funny difference, in terms of context from Indonesia and the Philippines. So, of course, I think Chingbee can you comment about that a bit, Chingbee? This kind of reversal.
Yeah, well, as I was looking through the clippings, Luis Teodoro kind of wrote about this in his, they were doing like these column wars where people were responding to the award, and Teodoro kind of addressed how, well, Teodoro noted that he had seen 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝘃 at a talk in the East West Center in Honolulu in 1980, and Jose was asked about what he thought of the detention and torture by the Marcos regime of Filipino writers, and there's kind of a response about, well, maybe they were writing badly, like a kind of tongue-in-cheek response, you know. And Teodoro also said that at a PEN conference, and Chanel Jose is the founder of Philippine PEN, Jose had opposed a statement which would have condemned the Marcos government for detaining writers, because that included the CPP founder, 𝗍𝗲 𝗪𝗂. And there was this contention that 𝗪𝗂 is not a writer.
Oh,
okay, so well, I'm just throwing out those kinds of these kinds of thinking that that I suppose also. Well, I don't know, Bowman. What do you think of those kinds of remarks now, where there is a kind of I personally kind of struggle to find how the logic went in that direction, you know. But it was like Jose had gone as far to say that if in the future this award is given to a Marcos supporter, I will return my award. And also he said that. And then he also said, if what was this other thing that he said? If we are going to argue for like literary merit alone, then maybe we should award. Then we should admire Marcos. Never mind that he plundered. No, I mean, of course, now we're from this point of view where we know that all those things were ghostwritten and things like that. No, but kind of. But those that was the rhetoric. No, that I do think was kind of notably confusing. No, that was being provided by Jose at that time. And if you put that next to Rizal Mojarras kind of talking about how we aren't as familiar with our neighbors' history and literature, then you can see how those kinds of ideas. And Chanel Jose had really, you know, he was like relentlessly writing about it at the time. So if those were the ideas that were circulating, now then it also certainly can lead to a lot of confusion about how to understand what Pramoedya stands for.
I think also you have to understand the reason why right-wing writers before 1965 say they felt terrorized before 1965. And I have no doubt whatsoever that they did feel terrorized. Mokhtar Luvis and many others felt genuine terror. But what was the origin of this terror? The terror was that the situation was evolving quite rapidly, with more than half of the adult population joining one or another left-wing organization. They were terrorized by the prospect that they would be living in a reality where their works were not popular. That was the terror that they felt. If the left comes to power, yes, indeed, their works would not have a big place in society. That was what they were terrorized about. And of course, today, whether it's the Philippines, Australia, United States, or wherever, someone who's a political liberal, if they hear a writer is terrorized or feels terror, they assume it's from the government or someone who's pro-government. Okay, it's true, Sukarno did ban the thing called the Cultural Manifesto, which, in my opinion, was he should not have done and was also unnecessary and was not followed up in any way with any serious material consequences. But it was not repression from the Sukarno government. In any case, Sukarno was not in control of his own government, but it was not repression from the government that was terrorizing the right-wing writers. It was the prospect that in a different kind of Indonesia, after a revolution or a big social change, their kind of literature would not, would not have a big place anymore, and that's what scared them, and that's what they could never forgive. For them, Pramoedya was the symbol of the cause of the terror wasn't him. He wrote some scathing polemics, but the terror came from the fact that what they represented in society was losing support and was heading towards becoming marginalized, not because of repression, but just because they were not what the people were interested in. And of course, the first thing they did when Suharto did come about was to make sure their position was restored to prominent place. All the left writers went to jail. And one of the most outstanding things that one has to note, that between 1965 and 1979, when the political prisoners were released, including Pramoedya Ananta Toer and other writers, not once did any of those right-wing writers ever raise the demand it's time for them to be released. Not once. So it was Jimmy Carter's lobbying from Washington that got Pramoedya and others released. No campaign, no pressure from the literary liberals in Indonesia between 1965 and 1970. Not once. Imagine that. 1 million killed, 15,000 in prison, including fellow writers. Not once did they say time for them to be released. Not one time.
Let's move forward with that thought on the kind of literature that they were writing. The so-called the so-called right-wing writers. There's a question here that's phrased for 𝗍𝗁, but I want to expand this. So the question is, would you consider for 𝗍𝗁 Pram as one of your influences as a writer? But I want to expand it in a more general sense. I want to ask our speakers if we consider Pram's kind of writing, which as 𝗍𝗁 really discussed in his work on Pramoedya's realisme socialis. It's a realist kind of prose. And when I first read 𝗍𝗁's Beauty is a Wound, Chanti itu Luka, when I first read it, it was quite different, I felt, from Pramoedya's kind of realism. So I think that would be immediately felt by someone who is acquainted with Pramoedya's writing, his novels, and then you enter 𝗍𝗁's world, which is somewhat different. So maybe I can phrase this the question in a broader way. What is the fate of realism or Pramoedya's kind of realism in today's contemporary literary life? And upon reading Max's book, Out of Exile, I see also that he gives a lot of importance to a kind of to the realist mode of writing, insofar as Pramoedya's works represent a certain kind of alternative historiography that Indonesians could refer to, could shape their historical consciousnness. So I recall here, the older disputes about realism, and the idea that realist literature has an important role in giving us a kind of historical awareness or in consciousness that can mobilize us to change the world. So I just want to ask our speakers, what is the fate of Pramoedya's type of realism in today's literary landscape? Maybe you can start off with 𝗍𝗁, because he was the original he was asked this question in a more narrow sense by one of our colleagues, Will Ortiz.
Okay. For me, when I read many of Pramoedya works, I think his realism is more like in the perspective of philosophy, is a kind of modernism realism. So like his approach is like I already said, this is based on the reality, and try to like already said that alternate history, because I think in many his conversations that he used to say that sons of official history is not really correct because there is a political agenda from who is in power, like the Dutch or the Indonesian governments, and so I think the Pramoedya approach is to it's not really like alternative story, but I think this is try to find out the real history. At least what he thinks it's more realistic history. Like I think it's in Arus not in Arok Dedes there is a kind of discussion about Chris that I think Pramoedya is not really think that the Japanese discovered the Chris and how it is influenced from the Portuguese and at all. I think he tried to make everything make sense and logic and that I think is approach is very modern. So uh, he think that he found that history is kind of there is a real history or this is a false history. Uh, the official history not really correct and at all. So, but in my own view, when I try to start to write my own stories, of course, Pramoedya is one of my influence. Is very much because I really think that I agree with him that literature is should be very political and says political movements. And then, but I found that because I think because the very since events in 1998 after the Soeharto fall down, and I start to write myself, I found that history is not only about which story is false and correct, but I think history is a matter of how you see the event and how you interpret yourself. So I think for me it's important to open the story to the interpretation of the reader. So sometimes I don't think I don't have a kind of forced to make the story correct. Like I don't think that the like in Cantik Itu Luka in Beauty Servants many of things that actually didn't correct in the historical context. But for me, it's more important how the reader perceive it, how they think about how the event in the story. So it's not because I think it's the job of the historian to make it write about the correct histories, not the fiction writer. So that's kind of a little bit different from me, between me and Pramoedya. And the other part maybe because I grow up with the other writers like I used to read in the teenage age some of popular novel that actually is kind of the product of the Soeharto era when the readers is being the politicians and so popular culture, popular novel is being flooded the market, and so I read a lot of horror fictions and martial art fictions that I think I want to use that because if those works can engage with the reader, I think we can use it too with of course with the dynamic of my story. It's not really martial art or not really horror, but how horror story or martial art story become political too. So I try to that. So in my works that didn't appear in Pramoedya works, like encourage myself to use folklore, to use fantasy, and to use something magical and anything that I think is we don't find that kind of in Pramoedya works.
Who would like to be next on this question? On the future of Pramoedya's realism?
Well, That's a question, the future of Pramoedya's realism, which I think is not only very interesting and relevant to the Indonesian context, but globally. I think in the third period that 𝗍𝗁 talks about, Pramoedya actually goes beyond what has been normally considered as socialist realism. It goes beyond that. I've been trying to grapple recently. I hope I can put pen to paper or finger to keyboard, as one might have to say these days, to something which tries to understand Pramoedya's historical novel genre in the light of the thinking and analysis of George Lukács, who wrote, in the 1930s, his book on the historical novel, and also the history and class consciousness. I think it's a struggle for me because Lukács has a lot of references to literature I'm not familiar with, but I think there's a lot in it which can be used to understand Pramoedya's realism. I think, just to try and sum it up, and therefore because it's a summing up, it's totally inadequate. I should say this at first. His realism differs from the earlier realism that developed, socialist realism that developed in Soviet Union, and I think it's also different from what a lot of literary critics would say is modernism. Is that the reality he wants to capture, and he definitely wants to capture reality, but the reality he wants to capture is that of process itself. So it's not a snapshot. It's not even a huge, big, complicated, elaborate painting. It's a movie. I sometimes, if I read the 𝗏𝘀𝗀𝗏 Quartet novels and Arak Dedes and Arus Balik, sometimes I'm not sure. Am I reading a movie or watching a book? Because if you're able, and Lukács talks about this in the way he tries to talk about how you can actually capture history or the spirit of history itself. You're talking about process, and I think that's Pramoedya's realism. It's capturing process, which means agency and all of the factors which act upon agency and which have consequences, and your characters are fused with that. In Pram's historical novels, history is not the setting. It's not the setting for a separate story. History and story are fused together. And I think that genre, it's the genre which Lukács in his final chapter, speculated might come in the future. I think that that's the question of whether that kind of novel, which can capture a revolutionary process in particular, will emerge in other countries and societies, as well as whether it will emerge again in Indonesia. So, and I agree with 𝗍𝗁 also. Pramoedya is a very very historical materialist writer. So he's after the truth of that process. Not that he doesn't use poetic license. I remember sitting in the lounge room in 𝗍𝗶𝗏𝗏 one day when, fuck, they thought, they didn't say fuck, geez, they thought, what are we going to do? We have Minka, the character, TRS, as someone who's infertile, who can't give children, can't have children. And in that original text, it was not TRS, it was 𝗍𝗁𝗏 Adisuryo. In the original type text,
Yes.
from what you had, 𝗍𝗁𝗏 Adisuryo. They're sitting in the, what are we going to do? The rather galak, what's galak in English? The rather aggressive,
Fierce.
fierce, the rather fierce commander of the Jakarta military command was 𝗍𝗁𝗏 Adisuryo's grandchild. So they were worried if we put Tito Adisuri in, we might have trouble from the family saying that, because the novels say Mika was infertile, but in fact he had at least one grandchild, probably actually more than, given the fact that he was a buaya, crocodile with the ladies. He probably had more than one, more than one child. They decided to change it, TAS, and of course it's poetic license also to make Minka infertile when the historical character was not infertile, but I think Eka's approach is not via the historical material's truth, but rather through presenting perceptions of the different individuals involved, rather than trying to reach back and see an objectively describable process, which from my orientation, there's nothing more interesting than the actual objectively describable process of change, and even more strange that that Pram was starting to describe in the 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗃 quartet.
Chingbee?
Maybe just to add briefly to that, in Pramoedya's magsaysay speech, he says at some point that each work of literature is necessarily an autobiography of its author at a certain level and in specific situation. So I thought that Eka's discussion, for instance, of like the 3 periods of Pramoedya's work and how you get to the 𝗩𝗁 quartet and it's a kind of synthesis. And Dr. Max also talking about the idea of process and how in the character of Minka, and then in the basis on Tito Adisuri, and then this idea of the autobiography of the author, Pramoedya. There's just an interesting kind of overlapping of these 3 figures now that then kind of in a very rich and complicated way invoke this historical process. So it's also all to say for that. I think there is so much that has yet to be engaged with in the future, with the work of Pramoedya.
Oh yeah, just on a side note that in the movie rendition of Bumi Manusia, or This Earth of Mankind, which Max dislikes, which Max hates. I don't know about Eka, but Max dislikes that movie rendition. You can watch it on Netflix. They
I'm
really
sorry,
bring back.
I don't watch it.
What?
I'm sorry, I don't watch it.
You don't watch it? Oh no. So, well,
Good decision, Eka. Good
decision is this, yeah, because it will ruin your day, according to Max. But in that movie, they actually brought back Minke to Tito Adisuri. That's it very explicitly, as in no longer with that that literary license, but they brought him back as that historical character, which I think is a quite problematic decision on the part of the director. So just for fun, if anybody wants to watch that, I think it's still on Netflix, just for fun. But Max doesn't like it. Okay, so yeah, no, so I just have a comment about that second part of Pramoedya's 𝗩𝗁, that second part which Eka Kurniawan talks about, the part wherein he's really working along the more traditional socialist realist direction, which is in Eka's book, actually, on Pramoedya's socialist realism. And also there he actually talks about also Lukács, in relation to Pramoedya. And since this is the second part or second phase of Pramoedya, I was very interested in that particular work, 𝗍𝗁𝗶𝗃 Peristiwa di Banten Selatan, or what happened in an event in southern Banten, which for me was kind of the purest representation of what that kind of literature would be. with the so-called 𝗍𝗲𝗊𝗁, 𝗍𝗲𝗊𝗁, which means to go down to the masses, right? That's the way that's the formula that, or the method that Pramoedya wanted to accomplish with that work. Now it's a very debated work, also very debated work, as 𝗍𝗂 mentions, and as I said earlier, and as Max said earlier, no Western critic has ever touched 𝗩𝗂𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗶 They think it's a very crude piece of, they wouldn't even call it literature, I think. So no, it has never been translated and very rarely discussed. That's why, as Max says, they just look at the earlier humanist writings as the best examples of Pramoedya's work, and then later on, and sort of pass over this period. But 𝗍𝗂 himself, I think, when he was writing his thesis, his 𝗍𝗶𝘁 on Pramoedya socialist realism, he was also pretty negative about 𝗩𝗂𝗶𝘃𝗀𝗶. But later on, he changes his mind. Diba, 𝗍𝗂, isn't that right? 𝗍𝗂, you sort of have a more nuanced understanding of 𝗩𝗂𝗶𝘃𝗀𝗶 later on. But in your earlier assessment of it, it was a pretty along the lines of the regular criticism that it was, it doesn't have that literary nuance, it doesn't have the depth of character. But in your later writings, in your later approach to that book, you sort of change your opinion. Can you talk a bit about this change in your opinion? Why did you go through this change?
Yeah, once I wrote the thesis, I think I'm to a little bit simplifications about those second period, but later I think my memory is correct. I wrote an essay about the exact works 𝗩𝗂𝗶𝘃𝗀𝗶 Selatan and discussed in I forget, maybe the Intarkayu or Salihara is the essay is more about this works. I think that's my view is a little bit changed, so it's more positive because this when I aware that not only about the 𝗍𝗲𝗊 but the works, but there is I think now I'm aware that there is some theme that many people didn't recognize in those works actually about how in this work actually the characters is face of the Islamic movement in the Bantams, southern Bantams. I think it's something rare in Pramoedya works that he's involved with the religious, political, especially Islamic political. If remember, there's on maybe it's a little bit things in Gadis Pantai, and there is a little bit negative sentiment to the religious leader in Medan, si Gadis si Bergigi Emas. But in Kalipertiwa di Banten Selatan is actually the Islam political that is because I think it's based on the rebellion of Islamic movement in the West Java at the time. So I think it's very interesting to study more about this book.
Yeah, because for some people like Gunawan Muhammad, that book precisely represents the evil of combining politics and literature. Yeah, that particular work is, the disaster of combining politics and literature, which is, aligns with that Cold War debate or dispute, which is not yet at an end, of course. But since maybe looking at the questions, maybe I can have a last question, which is given that the Indonesian state tried very hard to erase, tried very hard to prevent Pramoedya's ideas from spreading. What is the role of translation in such contexts wherein you have writers which are repressed by their own nations, by their own societies, by their own states, and then you have translators, trying to spread their work beyond to other places, other countries, etc. I know, of course, Max played a fantastic role in this, but maybe we can reflect on what is, if we're talking about today, Pramoedya, 100 years, who has a global impact. What is the role of translation in this process of trying to go beyond this erasure, go beyond this kind of demonization, the black and white, the struggles of the Cold War? How did translation help out so that we can bring out the voice of Pramoedya Ananta Toer and possibly other writers who have experienced the similar kinds of repression? Maybe Max can start off because he's the translator of
I think
Pramoedya's works.
in the case of what happened in the 1980s, it was a very basic, it only played a very basic role in the sense that we have to realize that in 1979, 1980, no one, except if you were somebody studying Indonesia, academic specialist studying Indonesia, no one had heard of Pramoedya Ananta Toer. And I think it was a very courageous decision by the Australian CEO of Penguin Australia at that time to take the decision to publish the series, especially after having only seen, one volume, because no one had heard of Pramoedya then. Harry Aveling had translated 𝗩𝗶𝘶𝗶, which had been published by a very small publisher in Singapore and had no significant circulation. So no one, of course, if you're following Indonesia, you knew who the political prisoners were after 1965. If you're one of that small category of people who are actually following Indonesia, you knew who Pramoedya was. But beyond that, no one knew who Pramoedya was. So the basic role at that point of the book coming out in Australia and then the UK and Singapore and Malaysia took some years for it to come out in the United States. Took probably another, I forget exactly, 6 or 7 or 8, maybe even 8 years for it to come out in the United States. So in its first publication meant that it gave Pramoedya and 𝗪𝗪 some protection, because there are more people who were aware of who he was and what he'd written and of his fate. So it just gave more There were more people who would write letters to Amnesty International, more people who would make noise. In terms of the spread of his ideas, I still think even today, while all of the books in English language have been in print non-stop since the early 1980s, have been reprinted non-stop, they're still in print today. Hopefully for still go on, but as the decades pass, a book published 40 or 50 years ago, the readership becomes more and more tricky to secure. I think even today, I was pleased. I did when my book Indonesia Out of Exile came out in 2023. I did a tour of the United States, and I spoke at 13 or 14 universities and several off-campus venues as well in that many, I don't know, a dozen or whatever cities. And what's pleasing to note that in just about every university I spoke at, Pramoedya was being studied by undergraduate students. I even noticed that on Amazon.com you can buy one of those study guides for teachers and students how to teach Pramoedya and how to study it with the essay questions and all the chapter notes and so on, if you want to cheat that way. But everywhere across all the universities, not all, but almost all of the universities that I went to, undergraduates studying Pramoedya. What was interesting for me, of course, was that it was not in departments of Southeast Asian studies or Indonesian studies that were teaching Pramoedya, almost none, close to zero, just one lecture or something like that. It was in departments of history, often with American lecturers with a global South connection of some kind, teaching his books, and of course in comparative and post-colonial literature departments. But in Indonesian and Southeast Asian studies, hardly taught at all. But it was very pleasing to go to give a lecture or seminar and see 20 or 30 or 40 undergraduate students who just written their essays on This Earth of Mankind or one of the other books that of Pramoedya that have been translated. But I think the actual process of the number of people who can fully get the most from the works, that process we haven't reached. That hasn't happened on a wide scale yet. Although my final comment here is the other thing which always pleases me, apart from the talking to all those undergraduate students who are reading Pramoedya, was to occasionally go onto Amazon.com and read the comments of just ordinary readers who bought the book and then comment on it. You know, there's usually 40, 50, 60 comments on This Earth of Mankind. Gets less for the sequels, but This Earth of Mankind, it's always, and it's interesting to see what those ordinary readers, not students of Indonesia, just readers of novels, have got from them, what they've learnt from them, what they've taken from them, what they appreciated from the novel. That's always very interesting and heartening to read. But I think you shouldn't overestimate the significance of translation beyond the political protection that international recognition gives. Of course, it's good that more people can read literature from every country in the world. That's obviously a positive thing, but I don't think we should exaggerate its role.
Chingbee?
Well, I am here thanks to translation. So I am able to read Pramoedya as written by Maxwell. And for that, I am absolutely grateful. I think it shows the practical, huge value of translation. As I was doing my research for this talk, I did find that among the polemics, there was a recurring advertisement for an exhibit on Pramoedya by my home department, the English department, at the time of the controversy. So, and it was put together by a particular class. I've not been able to confirm who the professor is, but it's one of our Southeast Asian lit classes. And I think that that's the hunch of people I've asked in the department is that that may have been a class of Dr. 𝗩𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀, who did the translation to Filipino of This Earth of Mankind. So I think that I suppose just that simple fact of what translation can do, that it can then get to us. And I do hope, it was pointed out earlier how there are all these gaps in translation, in the translation of Pramoedya to Filipino. And I do hope that, well, of course, there's a lot of kind of thinking about, translating, let's say, works from here to English, but how then it would be, I think, so meaningful also for Pramoedya to be translated and to Filipino here, for those of us here to be able to read. That's it.
Yeah,
just a brief comment. The interest in the Philippines must have been there from very early on, because I think in 1987 I was in Manila for an anti-Marcos conference of some kind, and I was in the bookshop at UP Manila, and I bought, and I still have it in my library today, a pirate copy of This Earth of Mankind.
Pirated?
A total mimic of the Australian edition with the Australian cover, but printed on newsprint and with a monocolor, a monotone color on the front and the back. So that's in the 1980s. That would have been only 3 or 4 years after it appeared in Australia. It has the original Australian cover, penguin paperback cover. So there must have been interest there in the Philippines. Someone must have been teaching it, surely, for multiple copies to be on sale in the UP Manila bookshop.
Yeah, Max, if I'm not mistaken, at the time, Marcos himself had allowed this as a legal form of kind of cultural cultural flow. He allowed the piracy of literary works, including Gabriel Garcia Marquez. We had many pirated editions of his work, Philippine pirated editions. This was allowed by the state. This was legal because they thought that this was the means by which Filipinos could gain access to world literature, if I'm not mistaken, right? And yeah. So going back to Chingbee comment about that the interest in the Philippines in 1989, the translation of This Earth of Mankind had already been done, and I think it was really circulated because I used it for my students to teach. I also read it myself. The one thing that's a bit funny though in the translation is that the Javanese notion of the night is ksatria, right? And in the translation of Quintanar, it's caballero. Caballero. Ksatria becomes caballero. So it's a kind of quite funny Hispanization of the of that word, kshatriya. So what else is so maybe it's Eka, no? Eka, who is one of the most well-translated Indonesian writers, contemporary Indonesian writers. So maybe he has something to say about the role of translation in the spread of literature and ideas on a global scale.
Of course, I think I want to tell about the ironic part of the translation that our government, Indonesian government, is actually aware that the important things about translations. I think since 2015, so they support translation grants and no. And then sometimes I was called by education department to discuss about how to promotion Indonesian's work, Indonesian literature work to foreign language. But at the same time, they had nothing to do with Pramoedya. For me, it's easier to promote Pramoedya to outside Indonesia to sell his book. But our government is ignorance to all of the until now. Even maybe I don't not yet talk about how the 100 years Pramoedya commemorations is the government is not involved at all. It's voluntary people, the readers, the community. So like Max already told, is all the cities doing discussions, this showcase, and even in small city doing that, but not the government, not the educational departments. It's kind of ironic because last year's they support the fund, the money to the same even 100 years of Nafis, but this year's not Pramoedya. Even the Jakarta Council as the funding to the government said they don't give the money, and so I think it's kind of ironic. They aware the importance of the translation, the importance of a soft diplomacy with the literature around the world, but at the same time, this material, the Pramoedya, is the perfect material to do that, but they didn't do anything about his books. So I think I just want to tell you.
So that's an insider story about this issue of translation from Indonesian to the global market, literary market.
If I can comment, Raman, I think actually I've only sort of come to this thinking recently, but I think in many ways, both in Indonesia and internationally, what's not more important, because the translation is essential for people who don't speak the original language to get access to the literature. But I think what's equally important, or important on top of that, is books and writing about them. So, and I think that also applies in within the country itself. Books and writing about Pramoedya's books, because I notice a lot of in what might be called the dunia literacy, or community groups that are promoting reading of books, and even amongst trade unions and so on, where there's also promoting a reading of books. The main way a book is promoted that way by the community is to collective reading. You know, you read 20 pages in one meeting, and people take turn in reading it out and then discussing it. That's too slow. What we need are people who are inspired by these works to write about them in popular ways. So, you know, that was one of the motivations for me to write Indonesia Out of Exile, apart from promising 𝗩𝗪𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁. But and I'm very happy now that maybe next month, in April, it will come out by through Penguin as an audio book. So, you know, hopefully that will help a tiny bit in promoting Pramoedya's works.
Yeah, so as Eka, Max and Chingbee, sorry, we're running to the end of our time. Maybe we can ask each of you just some final remarks on the 100th year of Pramoedya and what we expect or what we hope for the future. Maybe just a few final words from each of you. Can we start with Eka? Yeah.
For the younger Indonesian writer, or maybe Southeast Asian writer, is like the 100 years of Pramoedya Ananta Toer is how to fill the void that already left by Pramoedya. So I think this is our obligation to write something more with the inspiration for his work and his life.
Chingbee, maybe?
Well, I do think that with the rich discussion that we have, it is clear there's so much to gain from reading Pramoedya, and at the same time, there's also the clarity that there is a lack of reading, translating, and writing about Pramoedya. So I do hope that I think those are very kind of concrete things that need to happen, and why not in this 100th year?
Right. And finally, Max.
I just echo and agree with what Echo and Professor Cruz have said. I think nothing to add there. Good ones.
Yeah, this is a fantastic conversation, one of the best ones I've had ever on here in our Asian Literary Forum, and also on Pramoedya. Thank you very much, Eka. Thank you very much, Max, and thanks, Chingbee. So now we're going to the closing remarks of our Deputy Director of the 𝗩𝗪𝗁𝗁 Institute of Creative Writing, Rex Nepomuceno.
Thank you very much, 𝗩𝗪𝗁𝗁𝗁, and we would also like to thank, of course, the viewers of our stream for today. This has been the 2025 edition of the Asian Literary Forum. And of course, we at 𝗩𝗪𝗁𝗁 would also like to express our deepest gratitude to Professor 𝗏𝗏 and Guillermo, Mr. Eka Kurniawan, Professor 𝗍𝗁𝗁𝗁 Cruz, and Dr. Maxwell for making this rich and significant discussion possible. I'd also like to thank our project research assistants and administrative staff here at 𝗩𝗪𝗁𝗁 University of the Philippines Institute of Creative Writing for organizing the program and logistics of the Asian Literary Forum. Mr. Jasper Villasis, our project research assistant, is the head coordinator for this forum. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I myself was introduced to Pramoedya Ananta Toer through one of Sir 𝗏𝗏's classes when I was an undergrad. We also read the Filipino translation, the Telma Quintanar translation of This Earth of Mankind, of course, the Maxwell translations. But we only got to the second book, The Child of All Nations, I think, that semester. But I remember we also watched 𝗩𝗪𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁, Rainbow Warriors, the film version of that in Sir 𝗏𝗏's class. Today's forum was particularly important in reaffirming these connections between the Philippines and Indonesia, not just in terms of literature, but of course in our shared histories and struggles. There's much to return to this year, 2025, 100 years of Pramoedya Ananta Toer. It will be 70 years since the Bandung conference this year as well. And I think it's more crucial, more than ever, to return to these touch points of anti-colonialism, anti-colonial solidarity, struggles for freedom, especially within the Southeast Asian region. It's in part to train ourselves to move away from this knee-jerk response of always turning into the West and instead turn to our neighbors, to those whose struggles and experiences are woven much more closely to ours. And we at the 𝗍𝗂𝘁 Institute of Creative Writing hope that we were able to provide this particular space this afternoon. And again, thank you very much. This has been the Asian Literary Forum for 2025. This has been the 𝗍𝗂𝘁 University of the Philippines Institute of Creative Writing. Again, thank you very much.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Eka. Thanks.